Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. If a couple of you can, you should notice on the left side of your screen a cartoon bubble for chat. So feel free to type in there if you can hear me. That would be useful for me to make sure I'm not talking to a blank screen. Anyone? Anyone hear me? I'm not getting any indications that anyone can hear. Okay, good. Thank you, Lisa. So at least someone can hear. That means I'm broadcasting. Fantastic. So it looks like we may be joined by a few more people over the next few minutes. That's fine. I'm going to go ahead and get started because there's some introductory material. So thank you for coming. And we're going to talk today about Chinook disorders and what we do and don't know about some of the key ones. So I'm going to use a presentation, which you should be seeing. Hopefully the screen is up and you can see the presentation. Can anyone see the screen? Just wanting to make sure that the technology is working. No one's saying they cannot see the screen, so I'm going to assume you can see the screen. Great, thanks, Mary Jo, sorry. Good. So what are we going to go through today? Let me try and get over here and go to page down. Well, I'm going to have to hit play. So we're going to go through the key disorders in the Chinook, review some summary information on the bulk of those disorders. So just some real top line statistics and information. And then based on the feedback from the polls and the discussions that were on Facebook, I'm going to go into a bit more detail on cryptorchidism and neurological events, aka seizures, aka Chinook seizures, aka weird things like low blood sugar. And then at the end, I'm going to just come back and summarize across all of the disorders that we talk about today, what the summary recommendations are for each of those areas. Okay, now throughout, if you, okay, so Ruth's saying she cannot hear. Is there anyone else that can't hear? Hang on, let me just try and. Is anyone else not able to hear, but just able to see? I'm not sure what to tell you, Ruth. The only thing I can think of if you can't hear is to log out and try and get back into the Hangout. That might, occasionally, that might work. So we'll hang on a second while we try and get volume established with Ruth. Okay, while she's doing that, I'm gonna just try and move ahead a little bit. So in terms of key disorders in the Chinook, there's, lots of opinions out there. You talk to everyone and you can hear about things that have happened occasionally, and it's difficult to know if that condition is something to worry about or not. What I've done for the purposes of this discussion is go through the 3 key surveys that we've had in the area of health of the Chinook, and that's the Tufts survey from 1998, which was about 304 dogs. The vast majority of them were purebreds. It did include 69 crosses, but it is important to note that many of the crosses that participated in the Tufts study were not part of the COA program. So these are things like the St. Bernard crosses, for example, that were never part of the COA crossbreeding program. And there's a few other litters of crosses from North Down, typically, that were included in that Tufts survey that are not part of the COA program. That's why you can see some differences in the reporting of health between for the crosses in particular, between the Tufts survey and the 2 subsequent surveys, which were in 2005 and 2009. Those were run by the COA. A 2005 survey was 235 dogs. The 2009 survey was 208 dogs. And the 2009 survey was deliberately set up with some population geneticist input. So it was 104 dogs of both types, purebreds and crosses, and the purebreds were randomly identified using a statistical sampling program so that they would be a relevant sampling. The one thing to take away from these 3 surveys is it's difficult to compare results directly across them. So you can't necessarily take results from one and results from the next one and say things have gotten better or worse in the intervening time, because there were different methods, different populations, and different analytical methods used. So you can't do direct comparisons, but what you can do is look at these 3 surveys and say, they are going to give us some directional information and highlight areas to focus on in terms of health in the Chinook. And that's basically what I've tried to do in the next slides. And good, Ruth has been able to join us and can hear now, so that's really great. So that's the background on where some of this information comes in. I've also sprinkled in some anecdotal information, and I've called that out where it is, where it's included, just because anecdotal information is how we start to identify places that we should be focusing. And so it's good to take the actual survey data of where we should focus and some things that we're hearing, because that's going to give us the best picture of where we should be looking moving forward. And what I will say is the Tufts study did a pretty good job of coming out and saying, here's the top conditions that they were seeing. And you can read the slide, so I won't go through it, but it's a lot of the things that we would be talking about. Cryptorchidism, hip dysplasia, allergies. Interestingly, I found difficulty whelping, which was one of the top 5 conditions, a little bit interesting to see in the Tufts study. Shyness was also in the top 5. We'll talk about that more. Lick sores or lick granulomas and chronic diarrhea and arthritis were also called out. So these are, you typically talk to people about health in the Chinook, and overall Chinooks are reasonably healthy. But we tend to think about things like hip dysplasia, allergies, eye issues, and seizures. But in fact, when we've done some of these surveys, some other areas have interestingly come up. Now I've layered on, in a different color here, what came out of the 2005 COA survey. And a lot of that aligned pretty closely. So you can see the areas where it matched up. Arthritis didn't come out as much in the 2005 survey, but eye problems did. They didn't call it shyness, they called it temperament, but then they subdivided categories into shyness and extremely shy. Vaccine reactions and skin problems were what came out. They didn't call those allergies, although typically they're all sort of thematically allergies or autoimmune. Okay, so Christy says nobody's seeing the slide, so that's not helpful. Let me go back. Come on. Okay, can you see the slides now? I think I have to do. Okay, so now we can see the slides. Let me go. The problem is for me to go back in the slides in this format is a little challenging. Oh, that did not help. Let me. Can you still see the slides? No, gone now. All right. Hang on. Okay, how about now? It's a little less than ideal because I have to keep the things running on the left. But now can you see the slides? Okay, good. So they're back. So I'm just going to back up a little bit. Again, these were the three surveys that I'm going to reference. Tufts, the COA 2005 study, and the COA 2009 study. And again, the survey results are not directly comparable, but they do give us directional information. Here are the top conditions that came out of the Tufts study. So again, it's the ones that we would commonly think of and that you hear a lot when we talk about Chinook health. There are some ones that you might not necessarily think of immediately when you're talking about Chinook health. And then when you layer on the COA 2005 survey results, you get a lot of areas of agreement. They might use different words. So instead of seizures, that was called loss of control in the 2005 survey, but really referencing the same thing. There are areas over here where there weren't necessarily agreement across the two surveys. So eye problems came up in the 2005 survey, and it was not a topic really of discussion in the Tufts survey. Arthritis was actually the other way around, where it came out of the Tufts survey, but not the 2005 survey. And in this area, which is sort of, you'll see later, an autoimmune cluster, instead of allergies and hotspots, we called it skin problems, vaccine reactions. But thematically, those are all sort of in the same area. And then GI problems versus chronic diarrhea. So we have a terminology issue, but for the most part, there's pretty good consistency of the top conditions across the two surveys. When you layer on the 2009 survey, which is green, again, you'll see a lot of commonality. Again, the categorization is different. The one area that didn't come out here was cryptorchidism, which I think is because it just didn't get analyzed properly, frankly. Because if you actually look at the raw data, there's still significant cryptorchid occurrence in the breed. So I do think that's just a data problem. What also came out of 2009 is some other things that don't really map to anything that had been discussed before, including cancer, tumors, patellar luxation, cardiac issues, and dwarfism. Okay, so what I've done is I've tried to group these into themes across the actual words we were using to describe the categories. But here's the themes, and what it really comes down to. Oops, I gotta click in the right place. Cryptorchidism is clearly a problem that's come through across all of the surveys, and certainly what we would know from anecdotal experience. There's a broader category of reproductive issues. So whether this is difficulty whelping, problems whelping, pregnancy and birth complications, you lump all the data together and it's actually more of a reproductive issue category. Eye issues is still something that's there. I'm going to call this area neurological events because, and you'll see this in some of the detailed discussion we have, the word seizures is a very emotional one and also one that medically is very imprecise. And so I think we've had a lot of talking in the breed about my dog is or isn't seizure affected. My vet told me he didn't have seizures. That may or may not mean that the dog doesn't have some neurological complications or experienced a neurological event. So the language is going to be important here. You'll see that when we get to it. Hip dysplasia is obviously still a category. Spine and arthritis. So there's generalized arthritis, but when we see most of the data on arthritis, it seems to be mostly related to weak rears and things like spondylitis or inflammation or arthritic changes in particularly the lumbar spine. In many cases, people thought this might be degenerative myelopathy. We've had a lot of Chinooks tested and nobody's come back with DM. But we do have some dogs that have been put down even as young as 8 and 9 because of mobility problems related to arthritis in the lumbar spine. I pulled a lot of the sort of both digestive and skin issues together, and that's really autoimmune. And this is the way that you're starting to see it looked at in the literature, because it's not specifically chasing a skin problem or chronic diarrhea. It's actually a broader look at the lack of health of the autoimmune system in the individual dog. And that may manifest itself in different ways. So the symptoms can be varied between IBS, IBD, chronic diarrhea, or skin problems, but actually the root cause is often and more being tracked down to autoimmune problems. In terms of shyness, temperament behavior, there's a temperament category that comes up as a relatively more common than we'd like to admit category. And then I preserved, for the purposes of later discussion, cancer, tumors, patellar luxation, and cardiac dwarfism. So what I'm going to do is briefly through most of these, just give you some information and then go into more detail on neurological events and cryptorchidism. Any questions so far? Okay. Again, feel free to ask questions as we go through. In terms of the disorder summary, so autoimmune, now this is anecdotal, so we don't have a detailed study on it, but the more people you talk to in the breed, the more you find out this one's on sensitive stomach food, that one can't have chicken. So we do have potentially more dogs with IBS or IBD that have been officially diagnosed, but we do have a lot of dogs that seem to just have touchy tummies. We also have a lot of dogs that are on antihistamines all the way up through steroids at certain points in the year. So that's related to environmental allergies. So if you have a dog that the owner says, it's a perfectly healthy dog, just is on Benadryl for 4 months out of the year, that's likely because the dog has some sort of environmental allergy, even if we're not necessarily using that language to describe the condition. There are separate things where we've seen some thyroid issues bubble up. Now that can be autoimmune, it can be other things. In many cases, thyroid is sort of lumped into autoimmune from a research standpoint. What I can say, and this is hard data, is we have 18 dogs that have been tested in OFA for thyroid. OFA reports 0% of them as abnormal, but 11.1% of them as equivocal. So not quite normal, but not adverse enough to be reported as fully abnormal. So there's something going on in the thyroid area potentially. We do see in some northern breeds equivocal thyroids that are actually fine where the dog is perfectly healthy. So that could be factoring into it here. I think the summary to walk away on thyroid is we don't know if the handful of dogs that are on thyroid medication are there because of a common or more pervasive potential problem in the area, or if it's just random chance that's come up. But the more and more we start to see and hear about dogs with food and environmental allergies, it should be making us think a little bit more about what's going on in that space. Now, reproductive issues, this is for the breeders on the call of particular interest. I strongly believe there's a rising incidence of intervention in breedings. So I don't have full data. I just have some self-reported data, which was in 2013 and 14, 33. So roughly a third of the litters resulted in C-sections. Now, there's a variety of reasons for that, but it's a pretty sobering statistic. And over 50% of them required whelping assistance. Now, that may be in the form of just an oxytocin shot or a vet visit, maybe no oxytocin, but required some level of intervention. And that's, I wouldn't quite say something to panic me yet, but it's quite concerning. I'd like to have data from a few more years to understand, is that really just, did we go through a bad patch in 2013 and 14, or is there something a bit more pervasive going on? I can also say we have pretty hard data on males with fertility issues by 7. So this is where the viability and numbers of semen start to drop off pretty significantly. And up to, I know of at least a couple of males that were basically sterile by the time they were 8.5. And so again, that may or may not be normal or abnormal for other dogs, because semen health is a little bit use it or lose it, and often our males just don't get used enough. But in talking to a reproductive vet, she said, well, maybe you should be freezing more of your males by 5, or maybe we should be understanding why we're losing fertility in males as they get older, and is that truly abnormal compared to other dogs our size or not? And I just don't know, but it is something we should probably be taking a look at. In terms of what we are seeing on the female side and why there's whelping assistance required, it's mostly primary or secondary uterine inertia. So that's where we're seeing the oxytocin shots or the ultimate C-sections. Again, some of this can be related to litter size. I have a female who free whelped 2 litters with no problem, but did have primary uterine inertia with her 3rd litter, which was just a singleton. The singleton was because we used AI with relatively poor semen from across the country. So some of these things aren't necessarily indicative of a problem, but they might be. And if you add them all up, probably want to look into them a little bit more detail. Pup mortality remains moderately high. So we're certainly in the average to slightly above average on the pup mortality side. So that was about 9 to 10%, I think. I don't have last year's data, and last year was so atypical with just 42 puppies born, but certainly the years before that, we were in the 8 to 10% range. So across all these 2 things, not the greatest of news. What we do know is that autoimmune health and reproductive fitness are classic areas that are impacted by inbreeding depression. So this goes, all the way back to the poodle research done by Dr. Armstrong 20 some odd years ago. It is expected, actually, that as inbreeding depression hits a population, reproductive fitness and autoimmune health are some of the leading indicators of problems. So whether that's our problem here or not, I'm not making a conclusion. I have some personal thoughts about it, but certainly don't have any hard data to tell you one way or the other. I do think there's enough smoke in this area that we should be looking for the fire, and that more investigation of actual trends is warranted. Any questions on that? Okay. So I'm going to move on to the next areas. So these are the very common things when, puppy owners come to talk to you. They've read up and they say hip, eyes, and seizures are the 3 things that seem to be top of their mind that they're reading about on the internet as problems in the Chinook. Per OFA, and this is through the end of 2014, I think, the abnormal hip reports were 17.4% out of 728 evaluations. That number has been around 17% since I've had a Chinook, so for about a decade. Not really making a lot of progress. As a matter of fact, I'll have to go back and check. I think it used to be 17.2%, so it's possible we're But 0.2 to 0.4 is not a trend line. I mean, that could be statistical anomaly. What is clear is that we're not making significant progress in addressing hip dysplasia in the breed. Average hip dysplasia, I think, across all dogs is somewhere in the 10% range, so we're significantly over that. Interestingly, the Bell study, so the Tough study, noted a slightly increased hip risk for crosses. The other studies, 2005 and 2009, noted a lower rate of dysplasia for crosses, which is a little bit more what you would have expected, given, if nothing else, the requirement for dogs to have normal hips to be bred in the cross program. When you go back and look at the Tufts data, that included the non-COA crosses, like the St. Bernard crosses, and if I have my data correctly, the entire litter of St. Bernard crosses was dysplastic. So, you know, given the relative numbers, my guess is that the Tufts study overstates the hip risk in the crosses because of some of the dogs that were included that didn't comply with the program criteria of the COA program. Overall, hip dysplasia across all dogs, there's a lot of conflicting research. There's no genetic test for any breed. There's a little bit of an indicator potentially in Labradors, but nobody's really cracked this. There is a significant consensus that there's a large environmental component in hip health. And so even when you've got the best possible genes for hip health, you know, some environmental activities can exacerbate problems and actually produce dysplastic hips or arthritic changes in hips where there aren't necessarily genetic reasons for it. And so that's, I think, one of the things that we need to focus on as we're talking about improving hip dysplasia rates in the Chinook. So Corinne says she lost the sound. Is anyone else not able to hear? I'll keep talking just so that you guys have something to hopefully hear. I've typed into there. Do we have volume? Anyone else still have volume and able to hear me? Okay, so Corinne, I don't know if you can see Ruth's comment there. Oh, you can't hear me. Okay, so it sounds like, Corinne, again, what I'd recommend is dropping out and logging back in if you can. Good. All right, so while Corinne does that, I will move on to eye issues. So here's the thing, I'm gonna start at the bottom here. In 2005, we found about 12% of the dogs responding to that survey that came back as affected with an eye condition, 6% with cataracts, 6% with other things like retinal folds, PPMs, et cetera. So 12% is pretty high. The 2009 survey found that more like 3%, but it used different words. It didn't say, it said, did your dog have eye issues? Not necessarily, did your dog get diagnosed with an eye condition? So it's hard to tell whether the actual is in the 12% range or the 3% range. What I will say is, if you look in the OFA reports, so that the Companion Animal Eye Registry, now granted it's only been up a couple of years now, it reports 1.3% of Chinooks with abnormal eye ratings out of 78 ratings. So this is a significant lack of reporting of both normal and abnormal results. And a significant portion of those 78 are juvenile tests, so tests for puppies that were 8 weeks old, which is interesting. But based on all the literature, a puppy that has normal eyes at 8 weeks old is in no way guaranteed to not have cataracts by the time that puppy's a year. The canine eye actually continues to develop until around 4 months, 16 to 20 weeks. So what you're testing in an 8-week-old puppy is an incomplete eye, effectively, which, again, you can find some useful things out, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that the dog has no eye issues. What we're either not seeing people testing Chinooks as adults, which is disappointing, or people are testing their Chinook's eyes as adults and they're not submitting the forms anywhere. So the problem is that gives us a significant lack of information. So we can't understand, maybe we've massively improved eye health in the Chinook, which is great if it's true, but maybe we haven't and we just don't have the data to tell us what the problems are. So, I mean, you'll see when we get into the recommendations phase, addressing this significant lack of reporting of testing and potentially testing as adults is something we really need to focus on in Chinooks in the future. Okay, so moving on through temperament. So shyness was the 5th most reported issue in the breed in the Tufts study in 1998, with about 8% of Chinooks affected with quote unquote shyness. In 2005, we had 4.5% reported as excessively shy or aggressive, but 10% as shy. Now, these are all sort of owner-described temperaments. So what one person calls shy is obviously not another, what another person is going to call shy. But I think this is an area we don't talk about temperament as much. When we do, it seems to be, you know, a dog that just, who knows where that came from. He got his wires crossed or something. And I do think it bears a little bit more focus than we've perhaps been giving it as a disorder in the breed. The other thing that I wanted to call out, because this is interesting, potentially as people look to doing things ahead, in general, if you look at the health categories on the studies, the crosses typically are have a lower incidence of the disorder than the purebreds, whatever the disorder is. Occasionally that's incorrect, but mostly, you know, the trend line would be that the crosses have fewer instances of the disorders. Temperament categorically is where the crosses fared worse than the purebreds. So it's something, you know, as we're looking to potentially talk more about diversity in the breed, keeping temperament in mind is something that we should learn from the past. Okay, so changing gears again to arthritis and spinal issues. This was the 7th most frequent issue in the Tufts study, and it was not well covered in the 2005 and 2009 studies. Anecdotally, you hear a lot, I think I mentioned this earlier, about spinal stenosis and spondylosis. And you see this particularly in dogs that had normal hips but end up with very weak rears as seniors. I mean, some of that is just getting old, but we are actually talking about dogs that lose neurological function because of spinal arthritis. You know, they can't feel their rear feet and have significant mobility issues, not just because of aging and, you know, loss of muscle, but actual real problems through the spine and in their rears. As I mentioned, we have no positive test for degenerative myelopathy yet. It wouldn't surprise me, given the genetic makeup of the breed and where you see DM in other breeds, to have that. But even in dogs we thought might test positive, they haven't done so to this point. But it does mean we should be thinking about what's going on with some of these arthritic dogs that we're hearing about as they get older. Okay. Again, cancer tumors. So anecdotally, sure sounds like we hear about it a lot. Would love to get some hard data on it. There is a complication here, is that vets can call something cancer or call something a type of cancer, but if there isn't actual pathology and no specific lab report, the vets may or may not be true. So often people will have sent things into for path reports and come back with a different answer than they had expected going in. So I think when we talk about cancer, we should also understand, are we really talking about something where someone's had a pathology report, or are we talking about symptoms that match to cancer or match to a certain type of cancer, but in fact could be a different type of cancer? We do have a number of relatively notable cases of younger dogs with issues with cancer in the 5 to 8 range. Including dogs that have sort of died out of nowhere because of things like hemangiosarcoma. And we unfortunately have 2 notable cancer deaths in 2014 and 15 in dogs that were under 2, so really in puppies dying of cancer. And both of those do have pathology reports to back it up. So that's a very shocking thing. Again, could be completely anomalous, but not something that we would want to discount or not keep in mind, because that's the kind of thing that if you don't pay attention to, you end up in Bernese Mountain Dog territory, where all the dogs in the breed are dead by 5 or 6 because of cancer. And we obviously don't want that. There is a link potentially between cancer and inbreeding and autoimmune. So cancer is technically an autoimmune disease. It can be caused by lots of other things, including toxins and environmental exposure. So it's a very complicated picture with cancers. I would love to see us have more data on what's really going on in Chinooks. And are we just hearing about the 5% of dogs that are dying of cancer, or is there really a big trend going on here that we don't know about? And I don't know, but I did want to put it out there so that you're, because you're hearing the same things that I am in many of these places. Changing gears again, we've got patellar luxation. So this is a really interesting one. Per OFA, 10% of the dogs tested, and I think there's 55 dogs that have been tested. 10% of them are affected with luxating patellas. Now, this is mostly grade 1 and 2, and many of those dogs have no clinical symptoms. Patellar luxation has not been called out in health studies, and I would theorize if we have affected dogs that don't have clinical symptoms, that could be why. People might never know their dogs have luxating patellas. But given the 10% incidence that we've seen so far, it is something we should consider testing more breeding dogs for. It is a simple test. Your vet can do it in the vet's office as you go for, a regular SNAP test or something like that. You don't have to go to a specialist. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. But it might be something worth keeping in mind and having owners do at regular checkups of their dogs, just to see, again, do we have a 10% affected rate thus far because we've just sampled those dogs, or is it truly something that is more pervasive in the breed than we're aware of? Okay, moving right along, I get to cardiac. So there's no clear patterns of cardiac issues. We do seem to hear mostly in seniors about enlarged hearts, cardiac tumors, and significant heart murmurs. Where we've seen seniors with significant heart murmurs, they appear to not have had the heart murmurs as puppies. So this could be related to something else in the aging process, but you do see instances, even in some of the Perry Green documentation, of cardiac issues, and sometimes in particularly young dogs in the 60s. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on, but not something to be panicked about. Separately, of course, and we talked at length about dwarfism and MDR1, but the dwarfism carrier rate's still about 9%, and we've had more dogs added. We do have a genetic test available, which is the fantastic news here. And MDR1 is still about a 15% carrier rate. And the interesting thing here, of course, is we had no idea until some dogs came back as carriers that this was a problem in the breed. So the great news is there's a genetic test available. The good news, well, we haven't seen any dogs affected, but MDR1 is something where carriers have in some other breeds experienced symptoms. And some of the symptoms that can come with MDR1 are when they max out on one of the medications that is affected, they can get seizures, drooling, and tremor, which are symptoms we sometimes see in what we would consider seizure-affected Chinooks. So it's possible that MDR1 is part of our Chinook seizure puzzle. Okay, so that's what I had as summary on the high-level conditions. I was going to spend sort of the last 15 minutes diving in detail on cryptorchidism and seizures and what we know and what the current research is there. Before I dive into the more detailed topics, are there any questions on what I've gone through so far? Doesn't look like anybody's typing. So think about it. Feel free to come up with your issues as we go through it. In terms of cryptorchidism, so I've got some terminology here for you. So cryptorchidism is retained testicles. Unilateral cryptorchidism is where one testicle has descended and one testicle is retained. Bilateral is where both testicles are retained. Bilaterally, cryptorchid dogs are infertile. The abdominal cavity is too warm. It actually kills the sperm. So that's why in mammals, the testicles have to drop in order for the males to be fertile. Often you will hear people say a dog with one testicle down is monorchid, but in fact, monorchid means genetically the dog only has one testicle, not one retained, but only one total. And anorchid means they have no testicles. That's really, really, really rare. And in fact, what we mostly see is unilateral and bilateral cryptorchid. So I have two questions. Ruth asked about neuropathy and arthritis in older dogs. Let me come back to that a little bit later in the summary because I do have a little bit more there. And then the question is it confirmed with X-ray or manual manipulation? Patellas are confirmed with manual manipulation. So basically the vet just has the dog stand, raises one of the back legs, and tries to see if they can push the kneecap out of place. And then depending on how easy or hard it is to put the kneecap out of place and then put it back, the vet can diagnose whether it's a grade 1, 2, 3, or 4 luxating patella. So there's no X-ray required. It should not be sedation. The dog shouldn't be sedated. As a matter of fact, that can screw up the test results. So luxating patellas are pretty easy checked just with the vet feeling around on a knee. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to cryptorchidism. In the Tough study, we had reported 14.63% of Chinooks affected. And interestingly, Dr. Bell was considered that alarmingly high and was quite concerned about it. The COA 2005 survey found that 32% of 112 males that responded were affected, which is incredibly high percent. We didn't get clear data out of the 2009 health survey. So the guy that did the analysis didn't really call that out. And so I don't have the real data there. The good news about retained testicles, there has been some genetic research and is thought to be a simple recessive condition. Both parents have to carry the allele to produce affected offspring. But one thing I want to call your attention to, this is a graph of what they call the Hardy-Weinberg principle, which basically sort of estimates if you have a certain affected rate in a population, how much of the population is carriers. So you'll note we don't even have 32% on here, but if the 2005 health study is right and 32% of Chinooks are affected with cryptorchidism, that would mean that your carrier rate, it does plateau here a little bit, but you're above 50% of Chinooks that are carriers for cryptorchidism. Okay? Even if we're in the 15% territory that was found in Tufts, you're looking at something like 45% of Chinooks are carriers. So I think it's fair to say, even if we're seeing the lower end of affected dogs with cryptorchidism, it's a significant portion of the Chinook population that's a carrier, probably over half. The good news is that cryptorchidism isn't a massive impact to quality of life. It can completely disrupt your breeding plans, but other than making neuter a little bit more difficult, it doesn't really impact quality of life. Now, interestingly, there was a Dutch study in 2015 that was based on data from 11,230 litters from 12 different breeds, and it really looked at what happened with dogs that were assumed carriers of cryptorchidism versus litters that were assumed to have parents that did not carry. And it defined affected as retaining at least one testicle at 12 months old. So this is a pretty liberal definition of affected, because sometimes people consider dogs that retain testicles at 6 months affected. But this said, affected dogs have one testicle retained at a year. What this Dutch study found is that breeding carriers to each other produce statistically bigger litters and more male puppies than females. And it produced around 24% affected rate in males, which is exactly what you would suspect for a recessive condition. So in fact, this Dutch study said there's a reproductive advantage to breeding carriers of cryptorchidism because you're going to get bigger litters and more males. Which may be, by the way, one of the reasons that cryptorchidism is so endemic in Chinooks and in many other breeds. But it is interesting because I think a lot of times people think, oh, if you have a carrier, it's going to be a reproductive disadvantage. And in fact, that doesn't appear to be true. It does mean if people are selecting breedings based on what they think might produce bigger litters, they might accidentally be selecting litters that are likelier to be carrier to carrier for cryptorchidism. So they might be perpetuating cryptorchidism by selecting for bigger litters. There is a separate study that started in 2011, and this was led out of Iowa State. Some Chinooks participated in it. It was primarily a Siberian project. The goal of this research was to find the alleles or genes that produce cryptorchid dogs. Unfortunately, they didn't get conclusive results or testing, but they did note some areas of interest for further study. So there is the hope that in the near to medium term future, there'll be a test for cryptorchidism, but there certainly isn't right now. In terms of what it means for us, I think I called this out. The potential correlation or selection for larger litter sizes is actually favoring carriers of cryptorchidism, if anyone's doing it, and I don't know if they are, but at least be aware of it. We've occasionally had big kerfluffles in the breed about breeding affected dogs that are unilaterally cryptorchid. I mean, in fact, it isn't going to perpetuate cryptorchidism in the breed more than breeding of carriers. And we can't cull carriers because over 50% of our population, roughly, is a carrier of cryptorchidism. So basically, we need to continue to look at the genetic testing, but we're unlikely to solve this within the breed. It's quite fixed with over 50% of the dogs likely carriers. So we need to keep it in mind, but it's not something that's going to go away anytime soon. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears to neurological events, which can be seizures or can be things called paroxysmal dyskinesias, or can be things like low blood sugar issues, who knows. Just to define things, an epileptic seizure is medically a transient occurrence of signs or symptoms due to abnormal, excessive, or synchronous neuronal activity in the brain, right? So we think we get the picture of grand mal seizures from movies, typically, when you think about an epileptic seizure. Per the AKC Canine Health Foundation, epilepsy affects up to 5% of dogs on average. They define idiopathic epilepsy as repeated seizures in dogs that are 1 to 5 that have otherwise normal neurologic examination. And the other thing is these dogs have no known structural abnormalities of the brain, no metabolic diseases, or known toxin exposures. So where we see dogs that have toxin exposures and may have had a seizure, sometimes we try and call that idiopathic epilepsy. That actually doesn't meet the diagnostic criteria for idiopathic epilepsy. Separate from idiopathic epilepsy, structural epilepsy is the diagnosis for seizures that occur because of observable damage or malformations to the brain. So if the brain didn't develop properly, or if there's been sort of trauma to it or something, that's structural epilepsy. And reactive seizures are sort of a third class entirely, which occur in response to a stimuli, a toxic exposure, some environmental pathogen, some parasite load potentially. Those reactive seizures are not considered to be a form of epilepsy. Now, separate from seizures, in humans, there are seizures and paroxysmal events. The difference is in how they're diagnosed with an EEG. So seizures give you an abnormal EEG activity. That's the brain scan where you wear the little helmet like from the sci-fi movie scanners. Paroxysmal events don't present with abnormal EEG activity. And we use the word seizures in Chinooks all the time for dogs that have never had an EEG while experiencing an event. My guess is most Chinooks have not had an EEG while experiencing an event. Technically, we shouldn't call their neurological problems seizures, although we do out of, ease of terminology perhaps. But I think sometimes we get emotional reactions to my dog doesn't have seizures, and technically people might be right. And technically people may be hearing from their vet that the dog didn't have a seizure, even though someone else that observed what happened to the dog would think it's a seizure. If it doesn't meet some of these criteria, it actually isn't. And I think some of the crosstalk in the breed comes because of these actual definitions that we're not necessarily aware of or respecting in conversation. Chinooks experience a spectrum of neurological events. So they go all the way from the grand mal or tonic-clonic episodes, which include loss of consciousness, incontinence, rapid jerky movements and paddling, excessive salivation. This is sort of the classic what you see Hollywood do when they're talking about someone with epilepsy. We go all the way to the other end of Chinook seizures, which used to be called petit mal and are now called focal episodes or paroxysmal dyskinesias, which is loss of movement or lack of coordination, often limited to half the body, where maybe just the right side is affected, or the dog's front is fine, but it can't seem to get its rear together, versus complete lack of coordination all over the body. You can see excessive salivation in Chinook seizures. You can see head tremors, often a paw curl, and some other common things. But these are generally much less sort of neurologically stressful incidents versus a grand mal or tonic-clonic episode. And we have Chinooks that go all the way to the next thing, which is these very mild freezing, where they just seem to space out of it for a few minutes, or lose a little bit of coordination and not want to move, or have what some people have called low blood sugar, where the dog, does have this mild freezing or spacing out. And that all of these are probably neurological events. They probably need to be described with different words than we're using, but we do see dogs experience all of these. We have some dogs that are a mixture of these, so they don't necessarily fit into one of the categories very simply. They have some symptoms from one and some symptoms from another. And we have some dogs, thank goodness very rare, where the dogs have cluster seizures, and one or more of the above types of seizures recur over and over again. And these can actually be life-threatening because they'll raise the body temperature and can cause some serious problems up to death. So cluster seizures are very bad. The good news is I haven't heard of a Chinook with cluster seizures in a while, but we certainly have had them in the last 10 years or so. Typical onset is 18 months to 5 years for seizures. People tend to breathe a sigh of relief at 5 years and say, okay, we're good to go. But we do have some Chinooks that very late in life, 11, 12, 13, start to have seizures for the first time. It's not impossible that these are related to, Chinook seizures or something like that, but very likely in a dog that old that has never had a seizure before, they're probably secondary neurological events. They might be related to a brain tumor or some other metabolic problem that's coming through on the dog. So again, I'm trying to paint the picture of it's complicated in this neurological event space. We are likely dealing with multiple different things, and we're trying to use the same words to describe it. And I think that's inhibiting us from actually moving forward and making any progress. Now, I want to tell you about a 2015 study that was done mostly in Europe, but it did involve some in the US. It was really, their hypothesis was there was a lot of agreement between vets, particularly neurologists, but also non-specialists, into what was a seizure, what was an epileptic seizure, was the dog conscious even, and all those sorts of things. So they had, I think, 100 videos that they had these veterinarians watch, and then the vet scored each video to say, do you think this is an epileptic seizure? If so, do you think it's a focal seizure or a primary generalized seizure? And all this kind of stuff. What they found is that these observers actually had only fair to moderate agreement on if a dog was even having a seizure. So you see this, only 29% of the time did they all agree that the video they were all watching showed an epileptic seizure. And these are veterinarians. They had less agreement as to whether a dog was conscious or not, which is, you'd think something that would be relatively straightforward. They had very less agreement as to whether it was a focal seizure or a focal seizure with secondary generalization. So in no area that they scored these vets was there good alignment across the veterinarians of what they were seeing in the video, right? So we wonder why we can't talk the same language as Chinook owners and breeders. I mean, the vets don't even agree on what they're seeing and whether that thing is an epileptic seizure, a focal seizure, a paroxysmal dyskinesia. And so, again, we have had a lot of instances of people fighting. I saw your dog have a seizure. No, my vet told me the dog didn't have a seizure. They're probably both right. There is no clear categorization. This is just the conclusion of the study is there were low levels of agreement, and there's a need for further discussion between neurological experts on how to classify and describe neurological events and epileptic seizures. and train people so that they can get an accurate diagnosis, because right now they're all over the place. In terms of what we see in Chinooks, so I mentioned that the Canine Health Foundation expects the rough seizure rate or neurological event rate among all dogs is about 5%. In Chinooks, it's more like 8 to 9 to 11 is what we've seen. The trend line between crosses and purebreds is a little bit unclear. In 2 of the surveys, the crosses had significantly fewer incidents of seizures. In the 2005 survey, they were marginally ahead. We do have it split across the types, but I think that the more concerning thing here than anything else is that the trend line from 1998 to 2009 is going in the wrong direction for seizures in the Chinook. It's going up. Now, only a little bit, but still not the direction we want it to go in. Just some other background information on seizures. We've had 2 non-COA F1 cross litters that produced seizure-affected puppies. There were multiple affected pups in each litter. One was a Chinook with an Alaskan Husky, one was a Chinook Labrador Retriever. So this makes you think, if it's a recessive condition in the Chinook, how come an F1 cross litter produced it? The odds of the Alaskan Husky and Labrador Retriever happening to have the same recessive seizure gene is pretty low. So it just makes you wonder about that. Now, to be fair, the Alaskan Husky herself, she was also affected with seizures, so that sort of ups the ante of the likelihood of things happening in her litter. The other thing we need to remember is there's a growing list of things that are not neurological that can cause neurological events. So a dog can have a perfectly good neurologic system, and some of these toxic mushrooms, you can read it up in the literature, can cause neurological events. Various tick-borne diseases cause them, and seizures, as I mentioned earlier, are a common side effect of the MDR1 gene. Now, MDR1 may not be purely recessive. As I mentioned, in some breeds, they see some of the symptoms of MDR1 in dogs that are carriers that are not completely affected. So my theory is that it is part of our seizure puzzle, and we need to learn more about it. So what does this really mean for us? What's the bottom line? We shouldn't assume there's a single cause for neurological events in the Chinooks. Everything from low blood sugar to a tonic-clonic event, we should consider a neurological event. We should also consider it could be caused by completely different things. And that not every dog that has a neurological event is genetically at risk. They all might be, but they all might not be. As Corinne and some of the other things pointed out, we need a real classification system. We need to better categorize what's really happening in the dogs. What we do see is in the optimal selection test, as an example, it does test for things like exercise-induced collapse and episodic falling, and benign familial juvenile epilepsy in the legato. We've not seen Chinooks come down with any of those conditions. So no Chinooks have tested as carriers of that. Most of them are recessive. Some are recessive with incomplete penetrance. So this could truly mean we have a condition in the Chinook that is recessive with incomplete penetrance. Overall, we need more research on lines with MDR1 and the relation to affected dogs. So the strong recommendation is any dog that has a neurological event or relatives with a neurological event gets tested for MDR1. Because if their carriers are affected, that's a real simple way to hopefully make sure they never have another event. Separately, the COA has voted to sponsor up to 5 dogs to be tested at UC Davis for the seizure disorder identified in Belgian Shepherds. We have no necessary belief that we're going to come up with any affected dogs, but we do know there's a lot of Belgian Shepherd and Chinooks. So there'll be more information. If you have or know of a dog that is seizure affected or has had a neurological event that you are interested in putting into the UC Davis study, there'll be more information about how to nominate dogs later in January. And we really want to make sure that we don't want this culture of fear and finger pointing about your dog has a seizure, no it doesn't, it had low blood sugar. We need to know what's happening out there to dogs. We need to know what might have been affected. You know, what kind of event was it? What might have triggered it? What other things are related to it? Because otherwise it's like saying Chinooks have fevers, but we can't actually tell what's wrong with them by knowing they have a seizure. If we know, or a fever, if we know Chinooks had neurological events, that may or may not be a genetic seizure condition. I think we do have one, don't get me wrong. I also think there's several other things out there that we kind of lump into a genetic seizure disorder that probably are maybe a different genetic disorder or something altogether different. Without the right information or data, we're not going to go anywhere to make any progress on this. Okay, so that's what I had on seizures. Just, I know I'm running over, but I'm trying to get this done in the next couple of minutes. I wanted to say, here's a look back into the categories of disorders we've talked about. Really the summary recommendations, and it's just 2 slides, I think. Improving diversity in breeding and conducting detailed surveys to give us more information on autoimmune allergy issues and reproductive issues. In hip dysplasia, we have to review the current research, and we really need to educate breeders and owners on environmental influences, because the environmental influences make a big difference, particularly in puppies that are under 6 months old. I think we need to pay more attention to potential issues like arthritis in the spine. So this is where someone asked for more information on that. We don't have any other, unfortunately. We have people that say their dog has lost mobility, people that have had, very few have actually had spinal x-rays in older dogs to note spondylitis or spondylosis. So it's a scattered bit of information, but you start to lump all together all of the symptoms. And again, what you see is there seems to be some percentage, and I don't know what that is, of older dogs that are experiencing problem in this area. And so again, until we learn a little bit more about it, we're not going to be able to do much to solve it. I think we do need to pay more attention to the areas of temperament and cardiac. Do we really have issues here? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But if we're not thinking about it, we're not going to catch issues when they come up. And then simple things, prioritize in testing and submit forms for eye issues as adults. So the puppy stuff is great, but again, doesn't really tell us much about the eye health of the dog as an adult. So getting the more adults tested and submitting the forms, or at least consolidating the information in a central place that's publicly available, is going to help us understand if we've significantly reduced eye incidence in the Chinook. That's fantastic news. We should be celebrating it, and we're not, because we're not quite sure it's true. So let's make sure it's true, and then we can celebrate it. And then, as we talked about, prioritize testing of patellar luxation as well. If you know someone that has a dog that has been diagnosed with cancer, encourage them to get a pathology report. The type of cancer starts to become very important. If we're seeing a little bit of everything, that's probably more in tune with what you see happening in the general world at all, with all breeds. If we start to see lots of Chinooks coming up with a certain type of cancer, that's where we start to say, oh, maybe we've got an issue in the breed. But without those pathology reports, if nothing else, a vet diagnosis would be useful, better than nothing. But best of all would be the pathology reports. And then for lines that are at risk for dwarfism, just test. It's so simple now. It's not even terribly expensive, and you don't have to ship it to Finland. It just goes to the US. In the areas of cryptorchidism, we really should watch for new studies to participate in when they come up, but we shouldn't overly weight fear of crypt in breeding decisions, because it's so fixed in the population that if you use it as a criteria, you're probably going to overlook a good breeding. If you turn it down because of crypt, you're likelier to have a more significant health condition pop up. And then for neurological events, we need to test dogs with neurological events for MDR1 to say, is that covering a significant portion of our problems or not? We do need to, and hopefully they do it with canine neurologists, but we need reporting terminology and an application to capture the information, because trying to call them all seizures has not helped us in the past and obviously isn't helping us in the future. And this is the one area that I would say would perhaps be the biggest bang for the buck for the Chinook to conduct additional research studies with a university. Because if we've really seen it rise from 8% to 9% in the late 90s to 12 to 13%, in 2009, that's a pretty significant jump. It's going in the wrong direction. And this would be a place that we might benefit the most from research dollars for the Chinook. And that is pretty much all that I had in terms of today. Are there any specific questions that we haven't talked about as we've gone through? And while you're thinking about that, I do apologize for the technology not working seamlessly at the beginning. I'm on a new computer and the presentation worked a little bit differently here than on my prior computer, so my apologies for that. Right. I'm not seeing any questions come through. What I would say is please feel free to email me any questions that you have, or you can certainly ask them on any of the lists. In the future, we do want to do additional webinars on the optimal selection breeder tool and how that's only one input to a breeding decision, and also potentially more on genetic diversity. And certainly open to get your feedback on what topics you would like to see in additional webinars in the future. The other thing I would like to say is happy to get any feedback on how well this worked. And obviously there were some technical glitches and things like that. So please feel free to email me or anyone on the COA board with suggestions, what worked well, what would work better in the future. And yes, are others seeing loss of sensation in the leg spines of very old dogs? Yes, that is one of the symptoms that we see with the arthritis and spondylitis, is neurological. So actually what you can do is you flip over the paw of a dog, the rear paw, and if the dog doesn't immediately right the paw, then it's probable that they've lost some neurological feeling. If they keep their toes, so if you flip the paw over so that their toes are down and they're sort of standing on their toes, dogs with neurological deficit in the rear can't tell that and they'll keep standing that way. Dogs with no neurological deficit will immediately flip their paws back over to normal position. So that is something that we definitely see in sometimes in very old dogs, sometimes in dogs that aren't as old, right? So we see it in 8 or 9 year olds sometimes. I don't know how common it is. I think this would be a good thing to get even a quick spot survey up for. You hear about it a lot, but I don't know if that's because it only happens 5% of the time and you hear about it all 5%, or if it's happening 50% of the time and we're only hearing. Is it common in all old dogs? It is not unheard of, but I'm not sure I would say it is uncommon. I would say for a 14 or 15-year-old dog, I would expect some level of neurological deficit. For an 8 or 9-year-old dog, I wouldn't. So I think that might be the differentiator, is that we need to say, as a dog starts to get to 14 or 15, there's just going to be some things creeping in. But in a younger dog, you wouldn't expect to see that. Any additional questions? I'm not seeing anything come through. So apologies for the late start and the overrun and the technology. We'll work on that. But thank you very much for your attention. And this whole train wreck will be available on YouTube apparently, so that'll be fun for the future. Thanks everybody. Have a great weekend.